start with the answer, because there's no good reason to sit on it. Pull the record of people who have died inside Yellowstone National Park over the past couple of decades, and the shape of it is almost disappointing. Medical emergencies lead. Car crashes come next. Then drowning. Then falls. One compilation of Park Service mortality data and incident reports covering the years from 2007 forward counts roughly 75 deaths inside the park boundary. 18 of them medical, 17 motor vehicle crashes, 9 drownings, 8 falls. Wildlife accounts for 3. Across nearly 2 decades, in a park that draws close to 5 million visits a year, with grizzlies and black bears, and 2,000-pound bison walking through the campgrounds. Now widen the frame. Lee Whittlesey spent decades as the park's historian and archivist, and he went through the whole record, back to 1872, cataloging every death he could document. His count for drowning came out at around 121. That's more than any other single cause in the park's history. Hot springs, over that same century and a half, killed somewhere around 20 to 22 people. Bears killed 8. Bison killed 2. And the volcano, the thing with its own genre of documentary, its own apocalypse subculture, its own steady churn of viral posts. The volcano has killed nobody, not one person, in the entire recorded history of the park. So the part worth chasing is this. Yellowstone genuinely is dangerous. People are seriously hurt there every season, and some of them don't go home. But the park's reputation for danger and the park's record of danger point in almost opposite directions. The fear is aimed at the caldera and the claws. The harm comes from cold water, from roads, from footing, from cardiovascular strain at 7,000 or 8,000 feet. That gap between what people brace for and what actually gets them does real work. It shapes what visitors watch for, where they aim their attention, and what they file away as a risk worth taking. And the longer you look at it, the more it explains about why careful, sensible people keep getting hurt in a park they thought they understood. Let's take the myths one at a time, and let's be fair to them, because most of them started from something real that got bent along the way. Begin with the big one. The claim goes like this: Yellowstone sits on a supervolcano. That supervolcano erupts every 600,000 years or so. The last one was about 640,000 years ago, so it's overdue. You can find that arithmetic in headlines, in comment sections, in the opening 2 minutes of 100 different videos. It has the shape of a real calculation. It uses actual numbers from actual geologists. It's also wrong in a way that's easy to demonstrate. Those numbers do come from somewhere real. The Yellowstone hotspot has produced 3 enormous caldera-forming eruptions that we can date reasonably well. The first was around 2.1 million years ago. The second, about 1.3 million years ago. The third, roughly 631,000 years ago. Do the subtraction and you get 2 gaps. About 800,000 years, then about 670,000 years. Average them, and you land near 735,000. 3 eruptions, 2 intervals. That's the entire data set. You can't build a schedule out of 2 intervals. If someone told you they'd been to the dentist 3 times in their life, and therefore you could predict their next appointment to the decade, you'd laugh at them. Volcanologists have been saying a version of this for years, and the United States Geological Survey puts it about as bluntly as a federal science agency ever puts anything. Yellowstone is not overdue for an eruption. Volcanoes don't work in predictable ways, and their eruptions don't follow predictable schedules. There's a second problem with the arithmetic that almost nobody notices, and it's a little bit funny. Even if you swallow the naive average of roughly 735,000 years between eruptions, and even if you accept that the last one was about 631,000 years ago, the subtraction doesn't say overdue. It says there's still something like 100,000 years to go before overdue would even be the right word. The famous claim fails on its own terms, using its own numbers. Somewhere between the geology paper and the thumbnail, someone rounded in the direction of drama, and nobody ever rounded back. So what are the actual odds? The figure that circulates most, and the one the survey has used, is an annual probability of roughly 1 in 730,000 for another caldera-forming eruption. That number isn't a prediction. It's what you get when you take an average interval and convert it into a per-year chance. And the scientists who work on Yellowstone are the first to say it's a crude estimate that probably overstates the near-term risk, because the magma down there is mostly crystallized solid rock at the moment, not the sloshing pool the movies like to imagine. But the probability isn't the most interesting correction. This one is. When people picture a Yellowstone eruption, they picture the caldera event. Ash across the continent, crop failure, the whole disaster film sequence. That's the rarest thing the system does. It's the tail of the tail. What Yellowstone actually does, when it does anything volcanic at all, is pour out lava. The most recent volcanic eruption there happened about 70,000 years ago, and it was a lava flow. Thick, slow rhyolite, creeping across the landscape at a pace you could walk away from. Dozens of flows like it have filled and refilled the caldera since the last big explosion. If Yellowstone erupts again in any geologically meaningful sense, a lava flow is the overwhelmingly likely form. It would be a serious event for the park, a catastrophe for whatever it buried, and close to a non-event for the rest of the country. Below even that in likelihood sits the thing that actually happens on human timescales: hydrothermal explosions. These are steam events. Water sitting in the plumbing beneath a thermal basin flashes to vapor, and the ground above it lets go. The survey ranks these as the most probable type of future event at Yellowstone by a wide margin, and has said outright that the most likely eruption at Yellowstone would be a hydrothermal one. Events of that kind have torn up boardwalks in the developed basins inside the last few years in daylight with no warning at all, on ground where visitors had been standing minutes earlier. That's the volcanic hazard a person in the park actually faces, and it's a real one, worth respecting on its own terms. The honest correction runs the other way. The volcano isn't harmless, and it isn't asleep. It produces something like 1 to 3,000 located earthquakes a year. The ground rises and falls by inches, and the thermal plumbing occasionally throws rock into the air. All of that is real, all of it is monitored around the clock, and none of it is the thing people are afraid of. The dread is calibrated to a scenario with an annual probability somewhere in the millionths, while the actual volcanic hazard to a person standing in the park is a steam blast that could happen this afternoon. Nobody has ever been killed by a hydrothermal explosion in Yellowstone either, as far as the record shows. But at least it's a risk that exists inside a time frame a human being occupies. Now, the second famous fear, this one has better credentials because it did once come true on a regular basis. Grizzly bears. The number that tends to stop people is this. The odds of being injured by a bear in Yellowstone come out to somewhere around 1 in 2.7 million visits. That figure is built from the park's own injury record set against decades of visitation. Across one recent stretch of roughly 35 years, about 37 people were hurt by grizzlies in a park that logged more than 100 million visits. The denominator is the whole argument here. Nearly 5 million visits a year. Around 1 bear-caused injury a year, on average, through the 2000s. 8 bear-caused deaths across more than a century and a half. And here's what makes it strange. There are more grizzlies in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem right now than at any point in living memory. When the population was listed as threatened in 1975, the study team's estimate was around 136 bears. Recent estimates put it above 1,000. More bears? More people, far more chances to run into each other, fewer injuries. That combination doesn't happen on its own, and the explanation behind it is one of the more impressive things the National Park Service has ever pulled off. For most of the park's history, Yellowstone ran what was effectively a bear buffet. Open-pit garbage dumps sat inside the park and grizzlies fed on the trash. Some of the dumps had bleachers built next to them so tourists could sit and watch. Out on the roads, black bears learned to beg from car windows, a habit that goes back to around 1910 and got worse every decade as automobile traffic grew. The result was carnage, in the statistical sense. Between 1931 and 1969, the park averaged 48 bear-inflicted human injuries a year, plus more than 100 incidents of property damage annually. Through the 1960s, the average injury count was still sitting around 45, with more than 200 property damage claims a year. That's roughly one person hurt by a bear every week during the visitor season, year after year, for 4 decades. So the terror wasn't invented. Somebody's grandparents lived through a Yellowstone where getting mauled was a plausible outcome of a family vacation. Then, at the start of the 1970s, the park did something drastic and deeply unpopular. It shut the dumps. The last of them closed abruptly rather than gradually, on the reasoning that a slow taper would just teach a new generation of cubs the same habits. Roadside feeding was cracked down on. Garbage went into bear-resistant containers. Food storage rules got teeth. It was ugly for a while. Bears that had spent their lives eating human garbage went looking for it, ended up in campgrounds, and were removed or killed. The biologists who had been studying those bears for years, the Craighead brothers, fought the park bitterly over the decision, arguing the abrupt closure would gut the population. It was a real scientific dispute, and the argument over who was right about the short-term cost has never entirely died down. What isn't disputed is what happened to the injury numbers. Conflicts dropped to an annual average of about 10 after 1972. By the 2000s, bear-caused injuries in Yellowstone were running at roughly 1 a year. Bear removals fell from something like 33 black bears and 4 grizzlies a year in the 1960s to a fraction of a single bear a year in the 2000s. That's the entire mechanism behind the grizzly myth. The danger was never the bear's nature. It was the food. Take away the garbage, and the bear goes back to being an animal that would rather be somewhere else. The fear stayed exactly where it was, frozen at 1968 levels, while the reality moved on without it. The injuries that still happen tell you something useful about the ones that remain. They're overwhelmingly surprise encounters in the backcountry, most often with a female grizzly and her cubs, where a hiker came around a blind corner or over a rise and closed the distance before either party knew the other was there. And the park's own numbers on this are striking. Since 1970, 91% of the people injured by bears in Yellowstone were hiking alone or with just one partner. Only 9% were in groups of 3 or more. That's about as clean a piece of practical advice as you'll find in any park record, so it's worth stating the official guidance properly, because the half-remembered version of it tends to fail at exactly the wrong moment. The Park Service asks visitors to stay at least 100 yards from bears and wolves, and at least 25 yards from all other animals, bison and elk included. Never approach a bear for a photograph. In the backcountry, hike in a group of 3 or more where you can make noise so you don't surprise anything, and carry bear spray somewhere you can actually reach it fast, like a hip holster, not buried in a pack. The park's guidance is to deploy it when a charging bear is roughly 30 to 60 feet out, putting a cloud between you and the animal. And don't run. Running invites a chase you can't win. If you're only ever on boardwalks and roadside pullouts, your exposure is very different from a hiker's, but the distance rules still apply, because that's where most of the bad wildlife encounters in Yellowstone actually happen. The third myth is more tangled than the first two, because it's partly true and it gets misapplied anyway. The hot springs. Ask people what makes Yellowstone lethal, and a lot of them will land on thermal features, boiling water under a fragile crust. Someone steps off the boardwalk, the ground gives, and the story becomes a cautionary legend that circulates for years. That fear is not misplaced. The Park Service is explicit that hot springs have injured or killed more people in Yellowstone than any other natural feature, and the survey has made the same point flatly. Hot springs account for more injuries and deaths than the animals do, and it isn't close. So the thermal fear is the one myth on this list that survives contact with the data. 22 deaths from scalding since around 1890. Hundreds of injuries. Water in some of these springs sits above 185 degrees, hot enough to cause severe burns in seconds, and the acidity in certain features makes the outcome worse than a burn alone. The misapplication is in the share and in the direction. 22 deaths across 130-odd years works out to about 1 every 6 years in a park that now takes in nearly 5 million visits annually. Set that against 121 drownings and the thermal features drop to a distant second among natural causes. And in the modern window, the roughly 75 deaths since 2007, thermal incidents aren't in the top 4 at all. Medical, vehicles, drowning, falls. There's a second distortion inside the thermal myth, and it matters more than the ranking. People treat hot springs as a danger of the wilderness, something you meet out in the backcountry. Almost the opposite is true in practice. The overwhelming majority of thermal incidents happen at developed basins, within a few dozen feet of a boardwalk, in daylight, surrounded by other visitors. They happen to people who stepped off a marked path for a photograph, or who were retrieving a dog, or who simply didn't recognize that a patch of ground that looked solid was a thin crust with boiling water underneath. The park's rules exist because of exactly that. Stay on the boardwalks and designated trails in thermal areas every time, with no exception for a better angle. Don't touch thermal features or the runoff, because even the runoff channels can be scalding. Soaking and swimming in hot springs is prohibited outright. Pets aren't allowed in thermal areas at all, and that rule has saved more than dogs. A lot of the worst human injuries in Yellowstone history came from people going in after an animal. And the thermal waters carry organisms that can cause illness ranging from a skin rash to something life-threatening, which is a separate reason not to wade in even where the temperature seems survivable. Now, with 3 famous fears examined, let's go to the causes that actually fill the ledger. This is where the corrected picture gets built, and it starts with the one nobody puts on a poster: water. 121 drownings is the largest number in the park's death record, and it isn't close either. The victims are a broad, unglamorous cross-section: boaters caught out by weather, fishermen who lost their footing, employees on days off, swimmers who misjudged a current, people who went in after someone else who had gone in first. The physics behind that number are worth understanding because they're not intuitive and they don't announce themselves. Yellowstone sits high. Most of the park is a plateau at around 7,000 to 8,000 feet, and the water that runs through it is snowmelt for a large part of the visitor season. Rivers here are cold and fast in early summer, at exactly the time the air is warm and the scenery invites you in. The park's large lake surface can sit around 40 degrees even in midsummer, and at that temperature, a person can lose useful control of their hands and limbs in minutes and consciousness within a window measured in tens of minutes. Strong swimmers drown in cold water because cold shock steals the first breath, and cold incapacitation takes the arms a few minutes later, and skill has very little say in either. Then there's the hydraulics. Mountain rivers carry more force than they look like they do. Water that's moving at walking pace and sitting above your knees can already take your feet out from under you, and the park's own advice on stream crossings says so directly: water can be cold, fast, and more than thigh-deep, which makes any attempt to cross perilous. Add slick rock, add a smooth bank, add a waterfall downstream, and a minor slip becomes an unrecoverable one. The official guidance is short, and it has real branches to it. Wear a life jacket on the water. The park recommends them even at the swim areas, and there are no lifeguards anywhere in Yellowstone, including at the popular spots. Don't attempt a crossing that's above thigh height or that's moving hard, and turn back rather than commit halfway. Certain river stretches are closed to swimming outright, including sections of the fire hole in the geyser basins, and those closures exist because the combination of current and thermal input is seriously hazardous. And if someone goes in, the impulse to jump after them is the single most reliable way to turn one victim into two. Throw something that floats, reach with something long, call for help. The park's water safety guidance across the system is built around not entering the water yourself. Second on the corrected list, and first if you narrow the window to recent decades, the car. 17 deaths from motor vehicle crashes since 2007 inside the park boundary. In the broader Park Service data, motor vehicle crashes are the leading cause of unintentional death across the whole national park system. Ahead of drowning, ahead of falls, ahead of everything. And when Yellowstone's deaths are sorted by what the person was doing at the time, driving accounts for something close to half of the fatalities tied to a recreational activity. In the park's own annual reporting, traffic incidents have been the most common cause of injury or death. Full stop. This is the least mysterious danger in Yellowstone and the one people are least prepared to take seriously, which is a combination that shows up in the numbers everywhere, not just here. But the park has its own specific version of the problem, and it's structural. The roads are narrow, old, and built to follow terrain rather than to move traffic efficiently. They climb passes, they hug drop-offs, they have limited shoulders. They're carrying close to 5 million visits worth of vehicles through a season compressed into a few months. The drivers are unfamiliar with the route by definition. Many are in rented vehicles or oversized recreational vehicles they don't normally handle, and a large share are at the end of a long travel day. Then add the thing that makes Yellowstone unique as a driving environment. The entire point of the drive is to look at something other than the road. Every animal on a hillside is a potential sudden stop. A car door opening into a traffic lane. A driver drifting across the center line while turning to look. In one recent year, the park recorded 56 known vehicle collisions with large mammals, mule deer, elk, bison, black bears. And each of those is also a collision hazard for the vehicles behind. Falls come next, and they're a quieter category than people expect. 8 in that recent stretch, and a similar picture historically. The canyon rims, the ledges above waterfalls, the rock outcrops that look like natural viewing platforms. The rock in much of Yellowstone is volcanic and weathered. The edges crumble more easily than granite does, and a lot of the terrain that reads as solid overlook is decomposed rhyolite that gives way under a foot placed near the lip. Most fall victims weren't climbing. They were standing somewhere they shouldn't have been standing, usually for a view or a photograph, sometimes just to get past a crowd at the railing. And now the leading cause in the modern record, which almost nobody would name, medical events. 18 deaths since 2007, the largest single category, and over 70% of those in visitors 65 and older. These are heart attacks and equivalent cardiac and vascular emergencies, and they're not random bad luck. There's a physiological setup behind them that Yellowstone provides almost perfectly. Consider what a typical visit involves. Someone who lives near sea level flies or drives in and, within hours, is sleeping at 7,000 or 8,000 feet. The air holds meaningfully less oxygen. The heart compensates by working harder. Higher resting rate, higher blood pressure in the first days, more strain on a cardiovascular system that may already have quiet disease in it. On top of that, the person is dehydrated from travel and dry mountain air, probably short on sleep, possibly under-eating or over-caffeinating, And then they go do something that feels modest and isn't. A 2-mile uphill walk to a viewpoint. At altitude. In the sun. In a hurry. On day one. Research on sudden cardiac death during mountain recreation has been consistent for decades on the two things that raise risk most: unaccustomed exertion and doing it on the very first day, before the body has adjusted at all. One long-running study found that the risk of sudden cardiac death on the first day of vigorous mountain activity was several times higher for people who had slept low the night before than for those who had already spent a night up high. That's an unusually actionable finding. A short acclimatization period genuinely reduces the danger, particularly for men past their mid-30s, for people new to mountain exertion, and for anyone with a cardiac history. It's the kind of guidance a doctor should tailor to the individual, and anyone with a known heart condition should be having that conversation before the trip rather than reading about it afterward. So the actual danger profile of a Yellowstone vacation for the average American visitor looks a lot like the danger profile of any strenuous trip: the drive, the water, the drop-off, and your own arteries. It just happens to take place somewhere with bears. That leaves one more famous fear to deal with, and it belongs to the animal that does hurt the most people in Yellowstone. It isn't a predator: bison. Since around 1980, bison have injured more visitors in Yellowstone than any other animal. Bears, wolves, everything. They're the park's largest mammal. Adult bulls run to a ton or more, and a bison can hit 30 to 35 miles an hour, roughly 3 times faster than a person can run. The injuries are severe when they happen: goring wounds to the hip, pelvis, and thigh, occasionally life-threatening. The reason bison top the list is that they look wrong. A grizzly reads as dangerous instantly, in a way that doesn't require any thought. A bison standing in a meadow reads as livestock. They're often near roads, near boardwalks, near campground loops, moving slowly, apparently indifferent to people. So visitors approach to a distance they'd never consider with a bear, and they do it with a phone in one hand and their attention entirely on the framing. The historical numbers here follow the same arc as the bear story, and they point at human behavior as the variable doing the work. In the mid-1980s, Yellowstone was averaging 10 to 13 bison-related injuries a year. A sustained education and outreach effort brought that down to well under 1 a year during the early 2010s. Then visitation kept climbing, phones got better cameras, and the numbers crept back up into the range of a handful a year, with individual bad seasons pushing higher. A federal health analysis of one recent bad year found the injured visitors had approached far too close, and that the incidents clustered where you'd expect: people who left a safe distance to take a picture or to get around an animal on a trail. Elk sit in the same category, quieter and less discussed. Cow elk with newborn calves in late spring will charge, and bulls during the fall rut are flatly unpredictable. Elk are responsible for a steady trickle of injuries around the park's developed areas, where they graze on lawns and stand between people and buildings. The official distance is 25 yards from bison and elk, and every other animal that isn't a bear or a wolf, and it's worth knowing what to do when the animal closes that distance instead of you. If an animal reacts to your presence, if it stops feeding, turns to face you, raises its tail, paws, or moves toward you, you're already too close, and the answer is to back away slowly and give it room, not to stand still and keep shooting. Never approach an animal to take a photograph. Never get between an adult and a calf. Don't try to move a bison off a trail or a road. Wait or turn around. And if you're in a developed area, remember that the 25-yard rule applies in a campground and a parking lot exactly as it applies in a meadow, because that's where a lot of these incidents actually happen. So where did the reputation come from? Because none of this is hidden. The numbers have been public for decades. Part of it is earned history. The bear mauling era was real. It lasted 40 years. and it printed itself into 2 or 3 generations of American memory. When people over a certain age picture a Yellowstone bear, they're picturing the version their parents warned them about, which was an accurate warning at the time. Part of it is a single decade of extraordinary television. The word supervolcano barely existed in popular use until a British science documentary made it a household term at the turn of the century, and a network docudrama a few years later stitched Yellowstone permanently to the word. The framing of those programs was worst case by design, which is what dramatized science does, and the worst case is the version that traveled. Everything downstream. The algorithm-friendly headlines, the countdown clocks, the annual round of viral posts about animals fleeing the park is built on that foundation. The scientists who monitor the caldera now spend a non-trivial part of their working lives answering the same recycled rumors, and have said as much publicly. Part of it is the summer of 1988. Fires burned about 794,000 acres inside the park, 36% of it, over a season that ran from June into November. 9,000 firefighters were working the park at the peak. On a single day in August, winds pushed fire across 150,000 acres. The nation watched Yellowstone burn on the evening news for months, and a policy that had let some naturally ignited fires run got branded "Let It Burn" in the press. It cemented an image of the park as a place perpetually on the edge of catastrophe, even though the ecological reality was that lodgepole forests are built for exactly that cycle, and the park came back. And part of it, honestly, is that the true danger list is boring. Wear a life jacket, don't take the curve too fast, acclimatize before the big hike doesn't get clicked on. A caldera with a countdown does. The cost of that mismatch is behavioral, and it's specific. Attention is finite. A visitor who arrives braced for a bear and a volcano has spent their entire risk budget before they get out of the car. They'll scan a tree line they'll never walk into and then step over a boardwalk rail without a thought, because thermal ground doesn't look like danger and a bear does. They'll drive the loop road tired at dusk, in elk season, and consider the drive the safe part of the day. They'll wade a snowmelt river in July because the water only looks knee-deep, and the fear they packed was about teeth. And they'll walk 20 feet from a bison because a bison isn't the animal they were warned about. That's the whole gap, and that's the work it does. Almost the entire supply of caution goes to 2 things that hardly ever happen, and there's nothing left over for the 4 that happen every single year. So carry a different risk map into that park. At the top, your own body under load at altitude, especially in the first day or two, and especially if you're over 65. Below that, the road, which is the most dangerous thing you will personally operate inside the boundary. Below that, cold moving water, which kills more people in Yellowstone's long record than every other single cause. Below that, the edge of a viewpoint, and the ground beside a boardwalk, which is scalding and thinner than it looks. Below that, a bison at 20 feet, which is closer than 25 yards and always will be. Somewhere well below all of that, a surprised grizzly on a backcountry trail, at odds near 1 in 2.7 million visits. And at the very bottom, so far down it barely belongs on the same list, the volcano everyone came prepared to be afraid of. If one of those positions surprised you, say which one in the comments. The honest answers here are usually the interesting ones, and the ranking people expect almost never survives the first look at the record. If the myths on this list were ones you'd carried around for years without ever checking them, a like helps this reach the next person still carrying them. And if you'd rather keep having the popular version of things taken apart and put back together with the evidence, subscribing is how you get more of it.